Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley YouTube channel of your host, Jacob Berman. I am joined once again by David Mersch, who has recently become a frequent guest of this channel. And today we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is a bit controversial in religious circles, but when it comes to academia, pretty much every scholar, nearly every scholar, says that the Shroud of Turin is a medieval forgery, that it does not go back to the time of Jesus. And there is a document, and I'll be sure to edit it into this video. Um, there's documentation that the church admitted that the shroud was actually a forgery. However, there are still some that are out there that try to say, well, the shroud may be a forgery, but that it's actually, but it's still based on something earlier, an earlier image of Jesus. So what are your thoughts on this, David?
Oh, I have to agree with the majority of academics on this. You don't even need to really get into the scientific examination of the shroud to understand that it's, a fake. There are so many reasons when you just look at the shroud that you can determine that it's really an image of a man that's in the upright position, we'll say. He's not supine like Jesus would have been, as a corpse. He's supine, or he's standing, or he's at least in the upright position. And I'm sure you've read, many things about the shroud, and you can go on to a lot of different sites and see what they say about it. One of the most compelling arguments for it being a forgery or a fake is the position of his arms. If the way his hands are clasped over his genitals indicates that this guy was in an upright position, because if he was supine, if he was horizontal and he was dead, his arms would sag back. Now, there are Christian apologists that say, well, his arms were tied to his body and therefore they didn't sag back. They stayed closer, and therefore his hands could have, covered the genitals. But there's no indication of that on the shroud. There's no indication that there's any ropes or straps or, strips of linen that are tying his hands together in that position. So right away, you look at that and you go, yeah, this isn't somebody that's supine. This is somebody that's upright. And there are other things too. The distortion of his arms and his hands, the length of his hands is odd. The two images are not the same length. In other words, the image of the front is slightly different in length than the image of the back. The other thing is that there's no image. The images that are presented are from 90 degrees. In other words, there's nothing from the top of his head. So if this was a resurrection, you would think that the energy would be all around him, the energy of the resurrection. It wouldn't just be flat front, flat back. There'd be something coming out the top of his head. You'd see something out maybe out the bottom of his feet. The image is on a cloth that must have been flat at the time that this was done, because there's no distortion of the shroud wrapping around his body. So judging those things, I think you have to look at it like, yeah, this probably is not, something that was done when Jesus, resurrected. The other thing too is that in the Gospels, they talk about wrapping him in strips of linen. And this is a solid, piece, 14.5 feet long by about 3.5 feet wide. There's no strips involved in this, so it kind of goes against the gospel story as far as how they handled the corpse. The other thing too, and you got me thinking because I knew we were going to be talking about this. About the middle of the night last night, I started to realize, well, why is there blood on him? Why is there blood on the shroud? In a normal Jewish burial of the time, once they determined that somebody had died, the very first things that they did was to close the eyes and to wash the body. And if that was the case with the shroud, there wouldn't be any blood on the shroud, because the very first thing that they would have done once they got him into the tomb, they would have washed the blood away. They would have washed his body and then covered him with the shroud. So first thing this morning, I got up and checked the stories about the women coming to the tomb early on the Sunday morning to see, if there was a discrepancy there with what I was thinking. And all those stories indicate is that the women were coming to the tomb to anoint him, not to wash him. They were bringing spices to put on his corpse before wrapping him in strips of linen. So it's very possible that he was washed, and whoever manufactured the shroud was not real familiar with Jewish burial customs of the time. They put the blood in there to make it seem like, a real shroud, without realizing that he would have been washed before he was, encased in the shroud or wrapped in linen. So for me, it's, you don't need to do scientific testing on the fabric or whatever. You can just look at the thing and go, yeah, no, not the real deal.
So I wanted to go back to the discussions that we've had before on the swoon hypothesis, and the thing that some people might have issues. What I'm trying to say is, some critics of the swoon hypothesis might say, if Jesus had died by 80-70, which by your reckoning he did die by 80-70, you identify him with Jesus ben Ananus.
Yes.
As far as you're concerned, Jesus ben Ananus and Josephus is practically a sequel to the story of the Gospels. He's continuing the ministry after the 80-30s. Now, there are church documents that say James or Peter was the leader of the church in those decades that he was supposed to be alive. That's what critics of the swoon hypothesis would say. How would you respond to that?
Well, again, if you've escaped death on the cross, if you have somehow managed to trick the Romans into thinking that you were dead and you were taken down, anything after that, if you're alive, actually, and you recover from your wounds, you're a wanted man. The Romans are not going to be happy about the fact that somebody has tricked them and survived crucifixion on the cross. So for most of his adult life, he would have been in hiding somewhere. He would have let somebody else like James and Peter handle running the Jerusalem church. He may have worked in the background. They may have been in touch with him, but he certainly wouldn't have had a public ministry at that point, because he would have been a marked man.
Mm-hmm. So basically what you're saying is that James and Peter were public stand-ins for Jesus, who was really running the show behind the scenes.
Could have been. Whether he was or not, we don't have any way to determine that, because nothing was written. I suspect that he probably was still running the show. But we say show. The problem is that his supposed resurrection didn't start the rebellion that he was trying to start against the Romans and the temple priesthood. So at that point, he's kind of, I don't know how to say this, he's lost his goal. His goal was, if I resurrect, that will show the population that God is on my side, that God is influencing what happens to me, and that'll draw, people towards me, and then we can start the rebellion. When that didn't take off, then he's kind of a lost soul at that point. He's, he can't be in public. He can't really minister. Paul, and maybe James and Peter a little bit too, are changing his original message of sedition and rebellion and trying to go slightly in a different way. So he comes out when in public, finally, when the rebellion actually does start in 66 CE. That's when he comes out, and that's what Josephus is telling about Jesus ben Ananias. He actually comes out to preach in 62. He hides his identity for 4 years until the rebellion starts in 66. And then he, basically comes out in public and starts preaching. Because it didn't matter at that point if the Romans knew he was around or still alive. That they were at war with each other. It didn't matter. He wasn't going to be picked up necessarily by the Romans in 66 and re-crucified. So yeah, he might have influenced James and Peter, but it's hard to tell. There's no real way to tell for sure.
What do you think happened to the rest of his family after he died on AD 70?
Well, once it was found out that he had basically survived and escaped the crucifixion, and as I told you before, I'm a firm believer that Caiaphas was his father.
Right.
At that point, I think, and this would have been in 37 CE, I think at that point, Caiaphas was taken out of power along with Pilate. Whether Caiaphas was killed because he was involved in the deception, we have no way of knowing. Whether he disappeared, into history somewhere, we don't know. That's pretty much true of Pilate. I think both men were really, relieved of power in 37, both together, because the tomb was empty and the body was gone, and it looked as if Jesus had, faked his death and resurrection and disappeared. And the Romans, they wouldn't have liked that at all. They wouldn't have. They would have claimed, and I think I mentioned this to you last time, that they would have claimed damnatio memoriae on Jesus, so that anybody mentioning him in writings or whatever would have been liable for the death penalty by the Romans. So, that's a particular reason why there isn't a lot of stuff written about it.
Do you think that decree took place about AD 37 when he was crucified?
Did I think what? Say that
Did
again?
that decree take place in AD 37 from your reckoning?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's reasons for that. There, if you read the Gospels carefully, it pretty much appears that there were back-to-back Sabbaths in the week that he was crucified. And if you go back through those years, there's only like 3 years that meet that standard. There's 33, 36, and 37. And Vitellius was governor of Syria at the time, and he was in Jerusalem when all this was taking place. And I think he saw what was going on, and he saw Pilate stirring up the crowds by dragging Jesus out and, basically saying, the Barabbas story. Jesus and Barabbas were the same guy. This is an example of Pilate being who Pilate was. The scholars say, well, why was Pilate so different, during this whole thing with Jesus? And why did he, offer to let him go and all this kind of stuff? He wasn't. He wasn't being nice. He was being sadistic. He was taunting the crowd. He brought Jesus out and he said, you can say this Jesus or you can say that Jesus. And originally, Barabbas, his first name was Jesus. And Barabbas means son of the Father. So Jesus, son of the Father, or Jesus, the prophet, who do you want to save? And either way, the crowd was going to lose.
What's interesting about that is in Josephus, Jesus, son of Ananias, was brought before Governor Albinus.
Right.
And then Governor Albinus released him, which sounds a lot like the gospel story. Now, I know you put the gospels earlier than academics do, like before 70. But from the consensus stating no, uh, in conjunction with your chronology, your version of the swoon theory, it almost looks like the Barabbas story. One could say the Barabbas story, or one might say the Barabbas story is a pun on Jesus ben Ananus, depending on the dating of the Gospels.
Yeah, yeah. My reason for dating the Gospels where they are is because, to me, it's pretty clear that the deeper message in many of the stories is political propaganda. And political propaganda is only effective during the lifetime of its leader or the movement. As long as those two things are available, then political propaganda is effective. So considering that he was crucified in 37, that's when I think, that and just slightly before 37 is when the Gospels were written, because he was trying to send a message of rebellion to the people. And there are clearly stories that match up to historical events. To me, anyway, I see the deeper meaning in, like, the Gadarene demoniac being a allegory for the Jews being forced to live in Tiberias over an ancient cemetery. The meeting with the Samaritan woman, to me, is also very much a political propaganda piece. Well, if you write those after 70, they don't make any sense at all. There's no point to them. I also think that because of his method of writing, I think Philo is responsible for at least the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke. There's a fingerprint to how Philo wrote. He wrote Jewish works in Greek with Latin titles, and he wrote a lot of allegory. The majority of his work is allegorical.
So given that you think that Mark and Luke, written by the same person, those are the first two Gospels, which one do you think Philo wrote first, Mark or Luke?
Well, I think Mark was.
Okay.
Was. And
so
I think go ahead.
I was going to say, so Luke is his next work.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's progressions in the synoptics. In other words, in Mark, during the baptism with John, the spirit that comes down when this is taking place is just called a spirit came down out of the sky. In Luke, it's Holy Spirit, and in Matthew, it's the Spirit of God. The Jews would never reverse that order. In other words, they would never take, Matthew couldn't come before Luke. There's no way, at least in that particular story, because they would not take God out of something that they had written. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, Matthew wrote about God, therefore Luke would have had to include that in his work, and it's not there. It's just Spirit, Holy Spirit.
So do you think Philo wrote Mark and Luke around 37 to 41 CE?
Yeah. There's some other things too. I mean, other progressions that are in there. Mark and Luke, the tomb is empty or open when people get there, and in Matthew it is still closed.
When do you date Matthew and John?
Well, Matthew, I think, comes around 39, maybe a little bit later. And again, there's another progression. Mark and Luke use the name Yaris for the story about the 12-year-old girl that's died and Jesus brings back to life. In Matthew, that name isn't used. It's just he's kind of the leader of the community or whatever. That relates to a euphemism for Antipas, Herod Antipas, because the lands on the east of the Jordan that Antipas had in his tetrarchy were once anciently called the Havoth Yar. And so they use that name in the Gospels to connect to Antipas. Well, in 39, he was removed from power. So when Matthew wrote that story, it no longer made sense to include that euphemism about Antipas. So it was left out. The name was left out.
Mm.
That's a big reason why it was written around, 39, maybe 40, somewhere around there.
And John?
John, I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I don't know. Sometime later, a little bit later than that. But in John, you're seeing a change in the direction of the movement towards a more spiritual and theological point of view with, how they represent Jesus and what have you. And I think by that time, they started to realize that the rebellion was not going to take off. And so they started to, swing things a little bit differently. So it could have been in the 40s.
Mm.
I don't think too much later than that. I don't know. I was reading something the other day where they did a computer simulation between Luke and Acts, and they realized that they're not written by the same author, that there are too many differences in the actual wording and the vocabulary used and the rhythm of the writing and stuff like that, that the idea that Luke wrote Acts as well doesn't hold up. So, Mark and Luke, mid-30s, Matthew 39 to 40, and then John sometime after that.
And when would you date Acts?
I think Acts is much later. I think it is very late in the first century and may have relied on some of Josephus's works. I think it's that late. I think it could have been after 90, easily. Maybe after the first part of the second century. So it's not connected, with the synoptics. It's not connected with the Gospels. It's a totally different writing.
So what do you think Paul was trying to do during his activities in the 50s and 60s CE?
Oh, I absolutely think he was an agent of Rome. I mean, he was a Roman citizen. He was born in a Roman province, and he starts out, and he admits he starts out persecuting the early followers of Jesus. And then, as I mentioned before, he has this, miraculous conversion on the road to Damascus. And suddenly he's now a supporter of Jesus, except that he is changing the message. He's battling with the original followers of Jesus, changing the message, including, Gentiles into the group, trying to pacify. It's a very pacifistic message in Paul. Whereas in Jesus, in the Gospels, I mean, there's real evidence of violence and, rebellion. You see that when his immediate followers out of the 12 have problems in villages, and they come up to Jesus and say, shall we burn these places down? I mean, if Jesus was teaching a peaceful message, his closest followers weren't getting it then, because they're talking about burning villages and wiping people out for kind of minor slights, nothing major, just they didn't treat them right.
So from what you said there, you still categorize the Gospels as propaganda, like Paul is writing propaganda, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
In different directions, with different messages.
What do you think Philo's goal was when he wrote Mark and Luke? What was he trying to do?
Oh, I think he absolutely was trying to get the Romans out of Judea, especially, but Israel and that part of the Middle East that they had taken over. if he's responsible for the deeper meaning in some of the stories, then he was propagating rebellion. He was trying to stir the, and it goes throughout the Gospels that Jesus keeps saying, some people are going to get this. Most people are not going to get it, which means there is a deeper meaning there. There's a deeper message going through these Gospels that a lot of people don't understand. And he knows that there are some people that will figure out the deeper meaning, understand the deeper allegories of the stories. So I think Philo was, he went to, what's it called? He went to Gaius Caesar, and when they were having problems in Alexandria with the Greeks, and he was petitioning for the Romans to do something about the Greeks assaulting the Jews in Alexandria, and Caesar didn't do anything. He kind of sided more with the Greeks than he did with the Jews. And I think Philo was pretty much incensed by that. I think he felt that it was time to get the Romans out of there and let the Jews have their own place. And so,
do you connect this with Paul saying that he's a kinsman to the Herods in Romans 16:11?
Yeah, because he would have seen the early followers of Jesus as troublemakers, maybe zealots, I think. And the people that were in power, including the temple priesthood, really didn't want to upset the apple cart. They didn't want rebellion. They were doing fine. They were making their money. The Romans were pretty much leaving them alone. So the last thing they wanted to do was start a rebellion against the Romans and have all that thrown out, have their lifestyles ruined. I think that was even true partly of Jesus's family initially, was that, they thought he was crazy for talking this stuff. It's hard to quantify how, if Jesus was teaching a message of peace and understanding, that anybody would have a problem with that and want to kill him, as did some of the Jewish leaders. If he's teaching peace and understanding, that's what you want in the area. You want people to, turn the other cheek. You want people to be calm. You want, that to keep the status quo. So why would anybody want to harm him? Yet there are people that knew what was really going on and they wanted him out of the picture.
So going back to Paul, I mean, we were actually, yeah. When do you think he died?
That's really hard to say because there's no real hard, firm evidence. There's legend and what have you, and there's supposition that, he died sometime in the early 60s, but there's no proof of that. And he may have just, again, another Roman that disappeared into the woodwork after, he played his part in all this, after he was taken to Rome. That might have just been a sham so that the people that he was trying to convert to what became Christianity believed what he was saying. He couldn't go back to a Roman villa, and live the high life and expect people to, continue to believe his letters and what he was preaching. So they may have cooked up a story that, he was killed, that he was executed. My guess is he probably disappeared and maybe died of old age, but, it's really hard to tell. Same with Pilate, he kind of disappeared into the woodwork. And again, nothing really confirms what happened to him.
What do you think about Joseph Caiaphas? When did he die? Or is it the same problem?
Yeah, the same issue. Now, I've read some stuff recently that indicates from scholars that they think he died in 36. I don't think that's true. I think he was there for the crucifixion in 37. And My guess is that if that was the case and he had played any part in it, that the Romans would have executed him. So he would have been gone in 37, I would think, not 36. And I think, there are signs all through the Gospels and Josephus and stuff. And, I know scholars poo-poo this idea, but, Jesus was in touch with the Samaritans. And I'm a firm believer that the Samaritan uprising in 36, late in 36, he was the leader of that. And if you look at the story of him with the Samaritan woman, he's talking about some rebellious things and come to our side kind of talk, join us. But the interesting thing about that is that the Samaritan revolt took place late in 36. And Josephus indicates that maybe some of the leaders of that got away. When Jesus goes to Jerusalem in the Gospels, everybody's waving palm branches as he enters the city. They're not waving them for Jesus. They're waving them for the Festival of the Tabernacles, in which everybody built little, tents or tabernacles out of palm branches. That festival takes place in the fall. So when the Samaritan revolt failed, Jesus went to Jerusalem, and it's the time of the Festival of the Tabernacle. So that's why the Gospels compress those months in between late 36 and early 37 into like 1 week, just for dramatic effect. But he was really there for months, which explains why he went from, kind of being a hero to the people to maybe somebody that they really didn't want there, because they didn't want the revolt. They didn't want to upset the apple cart, rather than trying to explain that in 1 week. He comes in 1 week, everybody's waving these palm branches for him. They're all excited. Then a week later, they're, yelling at the Romans to crucify him. And it really didn't make much sense.
So basically, from that so Jesus was crucified during the tabernacle thing.
No. He was crucified during Passover.
Passover. Okay, I got things mixed up there.
You got your festivals.
Yeah. Which day of the week do you think he was crucified?
Well, my research, and it's a little bit iffy, but it would have been, from what I can tell, it would have been a Wednesday, probably the 18th of March.
Okay.
And this would have been a planned thing for him to be crucified. Again, to try to get the population on his side, because God is going to raise him from the dead. They picked 37 because it did have back-to-back Sabbaths, the Passover Sabbath, which would have started on the Wednesday evening and gone through the day Thursday. And then you would have had the weekly Sabbath, which would have started on Friday evening and gone through Saturday day. During those times, nobody's out and about. Nobody's working. Everybody stays home. You're not supposed to do anything. So the streets would have been pretty clear. So when he was taken down from the cross and then scooted out of the tomb, not many people would have been around to see what was going on.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.